Okay, so let's set up some lighting so we can get a better look at our character. So let's start over in the render settings, and under Redshift, let's switch over to the advanced settings, and we'll increase our sampling threshold to 0.1 so we can render a bit faster if we need to do any bucket rendering. Then we'll go through these one by one. Let's leave motion blur switched off. Then in globals, if you've got an RTX graphics card, you can enable hardware ray tracing, which is also going to speed up your renders. Then in the GI tab, I find using the brute force method for primary and secondary rays tends to be the fastest, at least with scenes like this anyway. Then we don't need caustics in our scene, so switching this off will also keep things running nice and fast. And we won't bother with any external compositing, so let's just disable the AOVs as well. And we'll close that for now, and we'll fire off a render to see what we've got so far. And it's definitely not looking that great to start with, and I can see we're having some problems with the edges of our texture maps as well, but we will sort that out a little bit later. But for now, let's see if we can give this some nice dramatic portrait style lighting. And I think for this particular render, we'll aim for almost a classical painting kind of look and use what's called a Rembrandt lighting setup. So we'll head up here to our Redshift menu, and under lights, let's bring in an area light. Then we'll switch views here in our viewport and make this a perspective view so we can see our whole scene. Then we'll change the shading so we can see things a bit easier. And we can now start to position that light in our scene. But every time we move the light, we'll need to wait for the render view to catch up, which can make setting up your lights a bit of a slow process. But I'll show you a few tricks you can use to make this a bit more responsive. Firstly, we could switch this over to clay render mode, which basically ignores all the materials, which allows the render to resolve itself a bit quicker. And you can see it's almost real time now. But I think there's an even better way to do this. If we just switch back to regular mode, we can instead use the RT or real-time mode, which takes a little while to load up, but when it does, we literally get full real-time rendering. And if we move this around, it's now updating instantly, which makes setting up our lights super fast and easy. So let's go ahead and give our portrait a nice dramatic look. And as I mentioned before, we're going to use the Rembrandt lighting technique, which the Dutch artist Rembrandt used a lot in his portrait paintings. So we're going to try and angle our light so that it casts a little triangle on our character's cheek here, which should hopefully give us that classical kind of look. So we could just grab this and move it around till we get the right angle in our viewport. But there is another really quick way to get our lights into position that I use from time to time on this kind of thing. And that's to actually look through this light so we can easily point it directly where the light needs to be. So with it selected, we'll go to Cameras, Use Camera, and Selected Object as Camera. And now we can see exactly what our light is pointing at from the perspective of the light. And we can orbit around just like we would with a camera and easily adjust the direction of the light. So I'm just going to frame this up on our model from the top left and try to cast that triangle of light onto her left cheek. And because we're getting live feedback now, this should be pretty easy to do. And from about there, we can start to see that triangle of light appearing here on her cheek. And I might just grab that area light and decrease the intensity a bit. And we can also change the dimensions of the light to sharpen or soften those shadows. At the moment, our light is 2 by 2 meters, which is giving us these fairly soft shadows. But if we were to scale the light down a bit and just compensate for the smaller light source by increasing the intensity or exposure, you can see that triangle becomes a bit more pronounced and our shadows are a lot more focused and sharp. And I don't think we want to go that dramatic. So let's soften them up again by bringing the size up to maybe 80 centimeters instead. And again, let's reduce that exposure. And I might just bring the light a little closer to the model as well. And I think something like that is fine for our key light for now. maybe just slightly less intense. And I wouldn't worry too much about finalizing our lighting just yet. It is usually a bit of an iterative process, so we'll probably come back and tweak this later once we've fixed our materials. But one thing I will do is add a bit of a fill light to fill in these completely black areas, so we can still see some of those details. So a quick and easy way to do that for portraits is just to come back up here and add a dome light, which is definitely filling in those dark areas, but probably a bit too much. And we also don't want it to be visible in the background. So let's scroll down here and disable background visibility. And we'll also decrease the intensity to about there, just so we can see a little bit more of those shadowed areas so it's not completely black. So I think that's a pretty good start, but I'd also like to choose a bit of a focal point for our portrait and draw the viewer's eye to this area. So they're drawn more to the face and the necklace. And we can definitely achieve that with the lighting by darkening the less important areas of the image. So we're going to use what's called a flag to block some of the light and keep the focus where it needs to be. So let's go back up here. And because we're still looking through that area light, let's switch this back to the default camera. And I want to place our flag down here in between our light and the character. So let's grab our area light. And as a flag, we're going to use a simple plane object. And if we hold shift when we bring that in, it becomes a child of our light and inherits the position of the light, which might make it a little bit easier to get into place. But it does look like the orientation is a bit off, which is why it's chopping through her head. So we'll rotate that the right way by changing the orientation here to -Z. And we'll scale that down and move it out a bit so it starts blocking that light. But because that plane is gray by default, it will cast bounce light into our scene, which we don't want. So just like a flag in real world lighting, we need this to be black and non-reflective. So let's create a new redshift material and apply it to our plane, which we can now rename to flag. And we can do the same to the material. And in there, let's make it black and remove the reflection. And we'll reposition this to block some of that light. And if we keep an eye on this area, let's bring this a little closer and slowly start raising that in front of the light like so. And the closer this is to the light source, the softer the shadow it's going to cast, and the closer to the subject, the sharper the shadow. So I'll just put this about here, and that's now cut off some of that light from the lower part of the image and made this area more of a focal point. And I think that should be fine for our initial lighting setup. But before we move on, I just want to head back here and add our lights to our layer system. So we can probably move our flag out of here now and grab all of our new lighting objects and add them to our scene layer to keep things nice and tidy. So we'll leave that there and move on to the materials in the next lesson.